What's up? This is the Other Map, and this is our video about Kansas City in the 1920s and 30s. The name The Other Map is a reference to the fact that most popular history, and certainly modern news coverage, tends to prioritize a very limited number of cities and countries. For example, is Washington, D.C. more important than New Orleans? Is North Korea more important than South Korea? Is Europe more important than Latin America? Maybe in some ways, but not on the Other Map. And that difference is where we get our topics. Call it a second opinion on what matters. This is our series about the Interwar era, or the period between the end of World War I in 1918 and the start of World War II in 1939. Needless to say, the wars themselves steal the Interwar era's shine. Most people at least have a sense of what happened in Normandy, or have heard of Iwo Jima. Less people are familiar with Dada, and the modern boy, modern girl movement is pretty obscure. The episode you're watching focuses on Kansas City, Missouri, a city right in the center of the continental United States of America, which was, without a doubt, one of the most infamous cities in the country during that time. This story is especially interesting because Kansas City is hardly an important urban area in the U.S. today. The scene we'll be talking about bloomed big and then wilted, almost entirely in the interwar years. Alongside minor sources, this installment uses information from the books Kansas City Jazz, Dangerous Rhythms, Dry Manhattan, and the Mafia and the Machine, as well as the Kansas City Library's website, pendergastkc.org, which focuses on this era of the city's history. You can find information on those resources below. Kansas City's glory days overlap with the era known in the United States as the Roaring Twenties. A term that is pretty apt as it began 17 days into 1920, with the kicking in of Prohibition in the USA, and ended in October of 1929, with the collapse of the New York stock market that triggered the Great Depression. However, the good times in Kansas City also overlapped with the Great Depression itself. It was one of a handful of regions in the USA that was relatively insulated from international economics. The Great Depression would, of course, end with the war machine kicking the U.S. economy into high gear after the country entered World War II in the 1940s. Interesting things were happening all over the world at this point. Art movements spread across Europe like butter, especially in France, Germany, and the Balkans. Late colonialism in Asia and North Africa gave us some geopolitical situations that are worth remembering, even though they should never be repeated. And, due to Prohibition in the USA, its surrounding nations in North America and the Caribbean played host to both tourists and vast smuggling operations. But those are other stories. Let's talk about the most relevant area for this installment, what was going on in the United States itself, specifically on the mainland. This time is probably going to be best known for Prohibition gangsters like Chicago's Al Capone, about whom multiple movies have been made, racketeers like Atlantic City's Nucky Johnson, whose reign was dramatized in the TV series Boardwalk Empire, and the Appalachian moonshine running industry, which resulted in the Southern car culture that NASCAR taps into. However, while the era was definitely violent, in the 1920s the USA roared in many other, lesser-known, less criminal ways. For one thing, jazz music exploded out of New Orleans and completely took over the country. It would later spread worldwide and would go on to be the source of much of the music we listen to today. Another major event would be the renaissance of Art Deco building construction that took place across the country, chiefly in cities like LA, Chicago, Miami, and NYC. This would inspire cities worldwide to get the same sort of facelift. In New York City, the Harlem Renaissance would permanently alter the global reputation of African Americans for the better. However, it was also indicative of the artistic spirit of the times, which saw disparate movements of all types pop up coast to coast. In addition, Dashiell Hammett would reinvent crime fiction in San Francisco, giving birth to noir, which remains an extremely influential genre today. The silent film era of Hollywood made similar progress and inspired movie industries worldwide. And, of course, Detroit car manufacturers would change how cities were laid out forever. But the interwar years of the city we'll be talking about had little lasting effect on the rest of the country, let alone the world, save innovations its residents contributed to jazz and, to a lesser extent, the USA's culinary traditions. This is probably why interwar Kansas City has largely been forgotten. but it was a big deal at the time. It was a mecca for partiers and gamblers, a Las Vegas-esque destination that was wild even by the standards of the Prohibition era, and those standards were pretty insane. With open gambling, drinking, and prostitution, Kansas City was a sin city of the U.S. during a time when the country was sin-centric. During the Interwar era, it was one of the greatest party towns the world has ever known. That's not an exaggeration, at least according to a journalist from the era. In a commonly referenced quote, he commented that U.S. citizens could skip Paris, then a capital of sin and prostitution, and just go to Kansas City. Eventually, this sentiment would get strong enough to earn the city the nickname the Paris of the Plains, although the city isn't even in the plains. But the journalist went further, putting it on par with far-flung colonial outposts like Port Said, Egypt, and Singapore, both of which were notorious worldwide for their depravity. I highly doubt things were at that level of crazy, but if you're going to build that sort of city in the United States, Kansas City had a great foundation. The place had always been rough and rife with criminality. In a sense, that vibe hadn't gone anywhere. Politicians were so corrupt here that they personally ran liquor, and famous criminals of the era, such as Bonnie and Clyde, would commonly use the city as a hideout. However, most people spending time in Kansas City in these years were just there to party. A multitude of people passed through the place too, as it was a train travel hub. On a not unrelated note, there were a handful of neighborhoods for partiers to choose from. For example, the 39th and Main area was a gambling center, and the suburb of Riverside, Missouri had a famous racetrack. Downtown Kansas City had what must have been the most notorious establishment in the city, a business-class restaurant where the waitresses walked around in nothing but see-through aprons and shoes, shaved their pubic hair into playing card suits, and picked tips up off the floor without using their hands. If that offends you, there were even more deviant clubs in the West Bottoms, which were exponentially worse. However, the bulk of Kansas City's partying took place on 3 separate streets that ran across town, 12th, 14th, and 18th Streets. 12th Street was the epicenter of nightlife. The half-mile stretch east of downtown was home to so many bars, nightclubs, and gambling establishments that a tourist had no hope of attending them all in a month's stay. Supposedly, there were 20 liquor-serving establishments on a single block of the street, from simple setups to massive cabarets with classy floor shows. At least one bar served both alcohol and marijuana. Both were illegal, was the owner's rationale, and gambling rooms facing the street were common, which shocked visitors. Similarly to booze, that was against national and state law. Count Basie and his band, big names in jazz, were the entertainment at the Reno Club, where late-night to early morning jam sessions were extremely popular. On that note, a classic piece of Kansas City lore would be a ritual undertaken at a club's opening. The owner would give a taxi driver money and the key to the front door, with instructions to drive far away and throw away the key. The clubs ran 24/7, and the music never stopped. The idea was that the doors never needed to be locked. 12th Street establishments like the Sunset Cafe embodied the spirit of the time. The manager, Piney Brown, ran a huge club, one with a huge roster of musical talent, mostly African American, that he treated like the stars they were. The bartender was a legendary blues singer. After-hours jam sessions attracted the best jazz musicians in the city, and crowds in the know witnessed music history. But Piney's boss was a numbers runner, part of an illegal enterprise that would eventually be copied by the government and evolve into state lotteries. The operation's bookies counted its substantial take just downstairs from the jazz players. 14th Street, just 2 blocks south of all those clubs, was Kansas City's red light district. The police didn't interfere, reasoning that allowing and regulating the prostitution industry was better than having it operating in the shadows, and a drive down the street gave you a view of houses with girls in every window, who would often bang on the glass with coins to get your attention. Even though the most coveted jazz gigs were on 12th Street, the brothels here supplied many talented musicians with work and played a big role in Kansas City culture. The third Prohibition hotspot was an entirely different neighborhood. The Great Migration, the movement of African Americans from the former Confederacy to northern cities, was seeing the East Side neighborhood of 18th and Vine turn into an important capital of black urban life. Black history in Kansas City goes back to its frontier days, One of the biggest businesses in the area in the 1860s was black-owned, but the population of African American Kansas Cityans would explode throughout the Prohibition era and greatly influence the metropolis. 18th and Vine was a sort of self-contained black neighborhood, possibly more so even than Harlem, as that New York area's most famous clubs catered to white people visiting uptown. 18th and Vine had a huge black professional class, and black-owned hotels, restaurants, clubs, and cultural institutions were common. There were often 2 African American newspapers in print during any given year, although the Call defeated all competition and continues to run copy today. It outlasted most white newspapers of the time as well. The role 18th and Vine played nationally was twofold. It was a mecca for black dreamers and entrepreneurs, but also an oasis for African American travelers, who faced a lot of hardships on the roads in those days. The institutions of the neighborhood provided black alternatives to their segregated equivalents downtown, and were often where famous African American baseball players could be spotted. I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but that definitely sounds like a better situation than you would have found in most places in the USA at the time. Another neighborhood of note would be the area now known as Columbus Park, for several reasons. For one thing, the neighborhood wasn't always named Columbus Park. In the Prohibition era, it was the North End, which contained Little Italy. According to PendergastkC.org, which literally has an interactive map of busts and raids that happened in Kansas City during Prohibition, the North End saw a concentrated amount of law enforcement action. It was also the location of the notorious Dante's Inferno Club, owned by a local mobster, with an interior made up to resemble hell itself. That sounds pretty surreal, but the bar was far from the only themed club to pop up. The one that sticks out the most in my mind was named the Bastille, where the waiters were dressed like they were in prison, and the clientele were served in cells. When a raid resulted in everyone going to actual jail, the irony wasn't lost on the New York Times, who ran an article about it. But going back to 18th and Vine, it's worth noting that the area was important to greater Kansas City, partially because the neighborhood was where most of the jazz musicians playing in the urban area lived. That, and it contained a number of jazz venues itself. In that sense, it was a vital part of the bigger urban ecosystem, as the local take on jazz was a big part of how Kansas City attracted tourists and locals to its clubs. Jazz, of course, began in New Orleans, but what happened next is lesser known. The music was nurtured by gigs in brothels and nightclubs in a New Orleans red light district named Storyville, especially in the corner of the neighborhood that served African American men. But when a crackdown on Storyville ended those engagements, jazz musicians moved up the Mississippi, mostly to Chicago. Jazz would evolve a lot in the Windy City under the patronage of gangsters like Al Capone, but eventually there would be a crackdown there as well, and musicians in Chicago would move to NYC, specifically to the scene in Harlem, which became jazz's capital and was from where the music staged its global takeover. However, musicians exiled from New Orleans also moved to Kansas City, where the nightclub culture that bloomed during Prohibition wouldn't see a cleanup until just before the U.S. entered World War II. And, for whatever reason, jazz in Kansas City evolved into a different form of the music, distinct from the style that developed in Chicago and New York City. What you're listening to is much closer to the jazz of the day than, say, John Coltrane's Love Supreme. In this alternate take on jazz, unusual rhythms were accented. The concept of riffing, playing repetitive chords to build to a crescendo, was highly influential. The saxophone was especially present in arrangements, and the songs tended to follow a blues, not jazz song structure. Not only that, but the way the music was played at gigs was unique as well. For one thing, Kansas City clubs being open all day meant that shows and jam sessions could go on for a very, very long time. And when you have an absurdly long gig, playing short songs becomes more of an annoyance than anything else. Switching arrangements every few minutes would be fine in a city where the band plays for less time, but in Kansas City, the songs themselves could last for hours. Sometimes one song would be played all night, and see musicians cycling through it while it was going. And if a musician was really on fire, he might keep soloing until he got tired. This was hardly the norm in cities like New York, where soloing lasted a certain number of bars, no more, no less. Kansas City jazz musicians themselves were also known to be pretty judgmental of newcomers, and would make that judgment known. Legendary saxophonist Charlie Parker, a Kansas City local who began his career towards the end of the Interwar era, caught the scene's bad side early on. In a famous local story, Parker messed up improvising during an impromptu appearance at the Reno Club, where members of Count Basie's orchestra kicked him off the stage. However, Parker wasn't discouraged, and in 1939 he would move to NYC, where he would begin to develop bebop, an important evolution of jazz. In addition to gigs themselves, the Kansas City scene developed a tradition of jamming, which varies from the meaning of the term today. A jam session these days conjures images of musicians mutually improvising, which certainly happened at Kansas City jams, but there was also an aspect of a musical battle. Coleman Hawkins, a legendary saxophonist, was notorious for playing shirtless and taking on all opponents, although the nature of the battles was outplaying the other musicians, not actually fighting. Because of all this, Interwar Kansas City was a highly unique town musically. It attracted jazz musicians from all over the country, partially because it may have been the most demanding city in the nation as far as gigs. If you wanted to prove yourself, Kansas City was the place to do that. Another staple of the city's culture, its culinary tradition of barbecue, also has its roots in the Interwar era. That such a meat-heavy cuisine would evolve in Kansas City was the direct result of its location on rail shipping routes between the livestock farms of the west and the lucrative food markets of the east. There was just an endless supply of meat. When the Great Migration brought black cooks to Kansas City, this surplus would see the birth of one of the USA's great cuisines. Although much of the evolution of Kansas City barbecue occurred later, the foundation was laid by a man named Henry Perry, who sold all kinds of smoked meats in the 1920s and 30s. Perry was well-traveled by the time he settled in Kansas City, but began cooking in Memphis, Tennessee. And so, much as Kansas City jazz evolved from music pioneered in New Orleans, the city's signature food evolved from culinary styles pioneered in the Black South. Although his sauce was very different than what is eaten in Kansas City today, and meats like opossum and raccoon aren't very common anymore, Perry was the original barbecue king of Kansas City and pioneered the style. The legendary modern restaurants at Gates Barbecue and Arthur Bryant's Barbecue originated with men that worked with Perry. Interestingly, Perry's clientele was noted as including a variety of Kansas Cityans. During an era of extreme prejudice and segregation, barbecue in the city was able to bridge the gap between black and white as well as rich and poor. As I mentioned, the sauce used was very different to what you'll find in Kansas City today. Perry used copious amounts of cayenne pepper in a vinegar base, whereas today the sauce is generally tomato-based and includes molasses. Also, what is arguably Kansas City's most iconic dish, burnt ends, doesn't seem to have originated in the Interwar era. Still, the city's legendary barbecue scene had its beginnings in the city's interwar heyday. The Kansas City of the time looked and functioned unlike cities of today. Billboard advertisements were everywhere, but unlike today, they were often the equivalent of graffiti, put up without permits and considered an eyesore. You would see them while driving a private car, riding the ubiquitous streetcars, or taking a paid drive in one of the city's numerous taxis, which in Kansas City were always painted in beige and black. Taxis were necessary because there was a large population of travelers in the city at all times. Hundreds of passenger trains passed through Kansas City's Union Station every day, including the Chief, the train of choice for the celebrities riding from New York to Los Angeles and vice versa. Many of these train lines had layovers in Kansas City, allowing time to get a drink or five before the train started rolling again. That is, if travelers didn't spend the night, which they could do at one of the city's many hotels. The actual layout of Kansas City was and remains unusual. Streets would often have large, intricately landscaped medians, and the city's actual landscape has a number of hills. Add in a relatively large amount of parks and the city's unique vibe, and you've got something special. Kansas City's landscape varied economically as well. Neighborhoods like the Country Club District were beyond wealthy, while ethnic enclaves like the Mexican colony were growing elsewhere. The Kansas City of the Interwar era was large, varied, sin-soaked, and altogether unique. A rare combination. Sounds like a fun place to me. But then again, Kansas City has always been something special and has a pretty unique history. The Kansas City of the Prohibition era didn't pop up out of nowhere. The region's history provided the foundation for the city as it existed between the world wars, and that history stretches back into the more or less unrecorded past. Supposedly, the region has been populated for around 10,000 years, first as a seasonal location for nomadic tribes, then as the site for more permanent villages. However, at least one truly notable indigenous settlement was situated here, one of the Mississippian culture. The Mississippians lived in multiple areas along what would be named the Mississippi River, but a sub-tribe would make their way west from that river's basin, up the waters of the Missouri River, and inhabit the Kansas City area from around the years 800 to 1300 CE. This means that the settlement predated Cahokia, the massive Mississippian city that existed in the St. Louis region from around 1050 to 1350 CE. Obviously, given that the Kansas City area settlement existed in the region for around 500 years, there were likely a number of interesting events that took place there. The Interwar era was basically a 20-year period, to put that in perspective, but I wouldn't know where to start as far as digging deeper there. I couldn't even find the place's name. In any case, by the time of European arrival, the land seems to have been more or less just forested hunting grounds for the Kansa, Otoe, Osage, and Missouri tribes that lived relatively close by. Adding to this history was the fact that the Kansas City region sits on a densely populated ancient trade route. At European contact, the major tribe along this pre-highways highway was the Comanche, but the route also crossed through the lands of the Pawnee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Apache, Ute, and Pueblo peoples. It would become known to the Europeans as the Santa Fe Trail. This route was an 800-mile corridor that led from ports on the Mississippi River to the early Spanish settlement of Santa Fe, now in the U.S. state of New Mexico. The first Europeans to cross this land were French fur traders, then living in the French North American territory of Louisiana, which covered much of the Mississippi watershed. Trade between the French and the Spanish via the trail was common before the United States bought Louisiana in 1803. After the Louisiana Purchase, however, Spain wouldn't accept U.S. traders due to the animosity between the two countries at the time. Eventually, however, trade along the route boomed again as U.S. businessmen began to trade with Mexico, which gained independence in 1821. Sadly, European trade would eventually heavily degrade the natural habitat of the Santa Fe Trail, a development that eventually contributed to a loss of regional power for the Comanche tribe, as the bison they depended on were cut off from their traditional feeding grounds. The Santa Fe Trail was the reason Independence, Missouri was founded by French fur traders in 1821. It was to be an outpost where travelers would pick up supplies for their trip to Santa Fe. The founding of that settlement would kick off a chain of events that would result in the growth of modern Kansas City. The town of Independence was basically just a tiny collection of buildings sitting on the shore of the Missouri River, but business was good. So good that a man named John McCoy decided to build another settlement nearby to steal that business. He named it Westport, and it became a rival to Independence. But after a farmer that had owned a huge plot of land on the waterfront died in a bar fight, McCoy and several others would pool their money and buy his land, building a third settlement, this one named Kansas Town after the local Kansa indigenous tribe. Westport would eventually win the economic battle with Independence, mostly due to it having better vegetation for horses to eat before they departed for Santa Fe. Eventually, though, Kansas Town would beat out Westport due to its position on the riverfront as the Missouri River became a heavily trafficked shipping route. Another rival settlement, Leavenworth, Kansas, existed upstream. These towns were all fighting for the business of equipping travelers, but that competition is gone today. They are now all part of the Kansas City metropolitan area. Kansas Town became downtown Kansas City, Westport is a district of the city proper, Independence is a nearby suburb, and Leavenworth is close to the airport. The area's business grew again after gold was discovered in Northern California. Migrants would come to Kansas City on riverboats, then buy the wagons and supplies they would need to get to San Francisco overland. With that boost to local business, in addition to the already strong economy related to the Santa Fe Trail and the ongoing trading with indigenous tribes, Kansas City grew greatly in the 1850s. But things ground to a halt during the U.S. Civil War, as conflict would hit the region hard. Its early effects were felt shortly after the war began in 1861. The Kansas City area is situated on the border of Missouri and Kansas, territories that leaned opposite ways politically, and the population was split along the lines of those supporting the Confederacy and those backing the Union, instantly creating animosity between the local factions. Those lines solidified in 1863 when General Order 11, a Union proclamation, literally exiled around 20,000 Confederacy-supporting Missourians from the state, including many from the Kansas City region. This exodus would come into play during the next few decades of Kansas City's history, which we'll get to shortly. However, the most consequential event to occur in the area during the United States Civil War was the Battle of Westport, a major military engagement waged near that settlement in 1864. The Union won a decisive victory and solidified its control over the area west of the Mississippi, basically stopping Confederate advances on that half of the continent. The battle was nicknamed the Gettysburg of the West because of its important influence on the course of the war. But soon after the Union secured victory and the Civil War ended in 1865, another battle began shaping, one between Kansas City and the nearby town of Leavenworth. At this point, both settlements had been decimated by the war, but their politicians knew that this sorry state would soon change for one of the two towns. Train travel was reaching westward at this point, and the two were desperately competing for the right to become the regional railroad hub. Whoever built a rail bridge over the Missouri first would be set to become one of the most important cities in the western United States. Eventually, a Kansas City representative in D.C. managed to use some underhanded political tactics to secure a bridge, and thus the railroad in 1866. After the end of its construction in 1869, the modern era of Kansas City began. However, modernity came slowly. The 1870s would become a legendary decade in Kansas City's history, and the history of the United States. Unlike the city's nightclub era in the interwar years, this portion of the city's history has never really left public consciousness. However, also unlike the nightclub era, it would not have been a fun place to hang out in. Things were relatively violent during Prohibition in Kansas City, but the 1870s were exponentially more so. At this time, the city was unarguably a capital of what would become known as the Wild West. Gully Town, a neighborhood slowly being carved out of limestone bluffs by the river, was becoming a home for Irish, German, and Italian immigrants, as well as freed African Americans. Conditions were savage. If you were smart, you slept with a gun under your pillow. However, the rest of Kansas City wasn't much more civilized. During daylight, open carry was common all over town. This was all due to the city's fast growth and position on the frontier. Kansas City was a great place to lay low and had a vast selection of nearby hideouts if you messed up in the city itself. Predictably, things got pretty rowdy. The list of locals reads like a who's who of Wild West legends. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok, and Bat Masterson spent a lot of time in town, while outlaws like the Dalton brothers and the James Younger gang hid out in the vicinity. Jesse James himself often visited Kansas City in disguise. This was likely to launder stolen money at some of the town's gambling establishments. The Dalton and James gangs had even seen their origins in the Union's General Order 11, which I mentioned before. They had been among the Confederate sympathizers kicked out of the area during the Civil War. Although this period was brief, the basics of it were a major inspiration for the entire Western genre. Shootouts were common, brothels were plentiful, and alcohol was usually easier to buy than clean water. There were classier entertainment options, but gambling was an exceptionally popular pastime, as was staying up late. One account claims that no serious games began before midnight. Kansas City had always been a rough town, but this era was over the top. However, in the bigger picture, this period was sort of a transition the missing link between Kansas City's sketchy frontier history and the slightly more civilized urban fabric that was beginning to form. In a few decades' time, the Wild West days of Kansas City were gone, even though their spirit wouldn't leave for some time. The shift between an absurdly dangerous town to a relatively respectable U.S. metropolis was basically possible because of Kansas City's position on the USA's rail networks, and it was due to the resulting changes that what happened during Prohibition was able to go down. But in order to understand exactly what happened, we need to dip into the history of the U.S. railroad system itself. In 1850, there were roughly 9,000 miles of train tracks in the United States, mostly serving the East Coast cities of the North. However, progress was quick. By 1852, Baltimore, and by extension the rest of the Northeast urban centers, had connected via rail to the Ohio River via a port in what is now West Virginia. This opened up a train and riverboat transportation system connecting the East Coast to locations in the Midwest, including Kansas City. Goods taking this trip would be shipped by train from Baltimore to the West Virginia port, by boat down the Ohio River, up the Mississippi to St. Louis, and from there up the Missouri River to Kansas City. The math here changed in 1853, however, when the East Coast trains were connected to Chicago. The Windy City sits on the Great Lakes, in the far north of the United States, but the fact that it was the first city in the middle of the nation to connect to the Northeast made it the de facto rail connection to the rest of the country. Because of this, expanding westward meant moving from the East Coast to Chicago, then coming back down to the center of the country before heading west. If you look at the modern U.S. train system, things are still laid out this way. Things wouldn't progress much until after the Civil War, however, as a huge panic hit the industry in 1857, and it hadn't recovered before the war began in 1861. Things started up again after the war ended in 1865, however, and in 1869, the final pieces of track were laid on the railroad that connected the nation. This route went from San Francisco to Omaha, Nebraska, then on to Chicago. From there, it only took a transfer to get to points east. The first train bypassed Kansas City, but many later trains would be routed through it. The city became and remains one of the biggest hubs on the route between the West Coast and the East. The amount of track in the country increased greatly in the next few decades, from the roughly 9,000 miles in 1850 to 93,000 miles in 1880. Kansas City was already an important point on railroad maps, but in 1887, a train line was built connecting the city to ports on the lower Mississippi and the Texas coast of the Gulf of Mexico. The company behind that railroad went broke, but after oil was discovered in Texas, it became a major moneymaker for its new owners as it was used to ship Texan oil nationwide. The importance of Kansas City on lines like these meant that the city had a lot of train-related industries spring up. For example, train car repair, and because it had this industry, new railroads would use it as a stop, which increased its rail-related economy, and on and on. By the 1920s, Kansas City had one of the busiest train stations in the country and the world. It was largely due to its position on the rail networks of the United States that Kansas City was able to expand into the city it would become in the Interwar era. Without this role as a hub, it could have ended up in nowhere. But by the turn of the century, it was far from a nowhere. By the 1910 census, 422,000 people lived in the metropolitan area, a big city for its day. The Kansas City area had been a few things of note: a Mississippian settlement, a few fur traders and opportunists living rough, and a famous Wild West frontier town. But a decidedly urban feel had taken root by the end of the 1910s, when Prohibition was declared. And that's when the party kicked off. It's no stretch to say that the good times in interwar Kansas City were mostly fueled by the 18th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which was a blanket ban on alcoholic drinks. Not counting irrelevant legalities, the amendment reads like this: the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. In basic terms, it legalized making, selling, moving, importing, and exporting alcoholic drinks in the USA. Now, I think most people can agree that alcohol addiction is a serious problem, and that drunk people have the kind of impaired judgment that will often result in criminal behavior, whether we're talking about harassment or manslaughter. But that kind of logic wasn't why the 18th Amendment was passed. Prohibition went into effect for one reason, and it had nothing to do with any public sentiment about alcohol. The 18th Amendment became law because the Anti-Saloon League, the force behind the Prohibition movement, was utterly ruthless. Founded in 1893 in Oberlin, Ohio, the Anti-Saloon League had become an extremely powerful political organization by the 1910s. Sadly, their playbook sounds a lot like a rogues gallery of modern political tactics. They straight up lied about their political opponents. They used primitive gerrymandering. They stirred up public sentiment by railing against vague industrial elites. They influenced elections with propaganda campaigns. One of their favorite tactics was to destroy the careers of moderate politicians that basically agreed with them, just so they could replace them with hardliners. In contrast to earlier prohibition movements that would try to run their own candidates, the League molded existing politicians to serve the dry cause via lobbying. And they had the money to do so, as they had the personal support of John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in the United States. But the Anti-Saloon League was most effective when it was co-opting other causes. For one thing, the Prohibition Crusade was happening parallel to a number of struggles, including the quest for women's suffrage and efforts to eliminate child labor. After associating themselves with general progressive causes, the League picked up support from those movements. In a great piece of branding, by its name alone, the League positioned itself against urban political corruption. The term saloon, which literally means bar, was also associated with a voter fraud system known as a political machine, which were common in major U.S. cities, including Kansas City. And, as soon as the USA joined World War I, the League's propaganda machine managed to convince the public that Prohibition was patriotic and part of the war effort. It was this association that drove the 18th Amendment into being. This pissed off veterans of that war, 9 out of 10 of whom opposed Prohibition when they got home. The Anti-Saloon League's wartime pivot also showed its true colors, as the propaganda it began spitting out was extremely anti-German American. That was partially opportunistic, as the League was taking advantage of the fact that the US was at war with Germany, the birthplace of beer, but it was also emblematic of what the organization was really about. The Anti-Saloon League drew its support from Protestants in the rural US, and was oriented against the largely urban populations of Catholics, immigrants, and Jews. In fact, the eventual downfall of the League had to do with its increasingly obvious association with the Ku Klux Klan. From these questionable origins, the 18th Amendment was born, and Prohibition went into effect on January 17, 1920. The enforcement of the amendment was laid out in a law officially named the National Prohibition Act, which was straight up written by the Anti-Saloon League. This legislation was introduced by a politician named Andrew Volstead, and is better known by its nickname, the Volstead Act. The penalties laid out in the Volstead Act were no joke. For one thing, you could do up to 6 months in federal prison for violating the 18th Amendment. Probably more punishing was the fine for breaking the law, which clocked in at $1,000. In today's money, that comes out to around $15,000, which was 30% of the average yearly income in the USA in the 20s. And that's the average income. When you take the rich out of the equation, that average goes way down. That high of a fine could easily have bankrupted most U.S. citizens. The legislation also clarified a number of things that the 18th Amendment left vague. For example, the Volstead Act made it clear that, even though the recreational alcohol trade was forbidden, alcohol's scientific, religious, and medicinal uses were still legal. Further, if the alcohol was used in one of those ways, civilians could make it at home. Along those lines, the Act clarified that, although possessing alcohol with the intent to sell was a crime, possession with the intent to consume was perfectly legal. As far as who specifically would be enforcing the Volstead Act, the Anti-Saloon League, which again wrote the legislation itself, delegated street-level operations to the Treasury Department. This is the part of the U.S. government that focuses on the economy. Among other functions, the Treasury Department prints money, collects taxes, and sets U.S. monetary policy. In fact, the new enforcement agency, known then as the Prohibition Unit, was originally part of the IRS. The point here is that most federal laws, like the Volstead Act, are enforced by the Justice Department, whose goal as a government organization is to catch criminals. The Treasury Department is built to do something completely different. Not surprisingly, in 1920, it had little experience with ground-level law enforcement. In addition, the League's understanding of money seems to have been a bit off. The 1920 budget of the Prohibition Unit, which was charged with enforcing Prohibition in the Volstead Act, was $4.75 million, which adjusts to roughly $70 million today. The budget for the NYPD alone in 1920 was $24 million, which adjusts to $355 million in today's money. Because of this, strangely enough, the police force of New York City received 5 times the amount of funding that the Prohibition Unit did. Keep in mind that the NYPD's jurisdiction was, of course, only New York City, while the Prohibition Unit's job was to enforce the Volstead Act nationwide. Now, if you've ever looked for a loophole in your life, you can probably guess what happened next. Not only were there a huge amount of methods as far as sidestepping the Volstead Act, but the organization tasked with enforcing the law was extremely underfunded and, by extension, understaffed. Although the Anti-Saloon League was an extremely effective lobbying organization that pulled off a major legislative coup by passing the 18th Amendment, they shot themselves in the foot when they wrote the Volstead Act. It set Prohibition up to fail. Not that Prohibition wasn't at all successful. Some locations, largely rural, embraced dry life. However, in cities especially, the amendment immediately fell flat. Most urban areas in the United States had an experience unlike Kansas City's, so this isn't directly related to the topic at hand, but the effects of Prohibition nationwide are worth discussing to put interwar Kansas City within context. And, although it was hardly your average city, the Volstead Act's effects were probably best exemplified in New York. So let's make a detour there before getting back to Kansas City itself. One of the first consequences of Prohibition in NYC was the mass hoarding of alcohol for personal use, which, again, was completely legal. Liquor stores sold out completely before the amendment kicked in, even if they were forced to close immediately after the Volstead Act took effect. In addition to bars and liquor stores, entertainment venues that served alcohol took gigantic economic hits. Fancy nightclubs and restaurants saw profits drop by half, and smaller businesses fared far worse. Cultural institutions closed all over the city, some of which had been in business for decades. Some of this may have been due to a post-war recession, as unrelated industries shrank as well, but not being able to serve alcohol at hotels was the reason that room rates spiked, leading to a loss of tourism revenue. This is not to mention that a quarter of the budget of New York State was lost due to not having liquor to tax. These were dark days for the existing cultural fabric of New York, but things weren't as dry as they seemed. Sure, alcohol-related arrests and hospitalizations went down immediately after the act passed, but they began climbing year on year as the 1920s went on. Before long, the drinking-related hospitalization rate doubled compared to what it was before Prohibition. This was because the drinking scene in the Big Apple had far from disappeared. Instead, it had adapted. For example, in the past you might have taken a taxi to a bar to get drunk. After Prohibition took effect, New York taxis often acted as mobile liquor stores. You could just buy a flask on the way to your destination. In place of a bar, most restaurants would mix drinks if you brought in your own booze, taking advantage of one of the many loopholes in the Volstead Act. You could also buy your liquor from one of the galaxy of pharmacies that sprung up selling alcohol for all types of medical uses. Soda fountains, which the Anti-Saloon League claimed would replace bars, often just served liquor in soda bottles. Candy shops even got in on the action, selling booze-filled chocolates to customers in the know. And that's not even mentioning speakeasies. In New York, these illegal bars range from mega clubs to simple booze and table operations, from huge Greenwich Village casinos to Harlem rent parties, which were thrown when the host needed some extra cash to make rent. The basics of the speakeasy were always the same. You had to know someone, drop a name, or in some cases know a password, and they were everywhere in NYC. As mentioned before, the fine for breaking the Volstead Act once was $15,000 in today's money. and that price only went up the more times you got caught. Now, there were two reasons why people would risk losing that kind of money in a city like New York. One was that the market for illegal booze was extremely lucrative, generating enough money to make up for that sort of loss. The other was that the odds of getting caught were extremely low. First, the utter lack of funding for nationwide prohibition enforcement meant that most of the prohibition unit's efforts went towards shutting down bigger operations. Second, the fact was that no one else in New York City cared about enforcing the 18th Amendment. The police force was so corrupted by the liquor trade that you were more likely to get your operation shut down for missing a bribe payment than you were for actually breaking the law. Some NYPD stations had their outgoing phone lines cut because officers were constantly tipping off their speakeasy friends to raids. In addition, the NYPD wouldn't cooperate or share intelligence with federal prohibition agents, leaving them almost completely in the dark. On top of all this, NYC politicians would habitually and intentionally cut funding for Volstead Act enforcement on the local level. Because of all this, New York was known as a wet city. At best, wet cities ignored prohibition. Usually, they actively undermined it, creating a sort of anything-goes gangland party vibe throughout the metropolitan area. Far from bringing drinking under control in urban centers, Prohibition basically let a total demon loose in the form of wet cities, of which New York was one of many. Whenever wet cities are discussed, the question of which city was the wettest is bound to come up. Chicago, New Orleans, Pittsburgh, D.C., Baltimore, San Francisco, and Kansas City are often involved in that conversation, but the conclusion of such a contest usually comes down to either Detroit or NYC taking the cake. During Prohibition, Detroit was the center of liquor smuggling in North America. Part of its metropolitan area lies in Canada, and an estimated 75% of all Prohibition-era alcohol consumed in the USA passed through the greater region. This is on top of Detroit having rowdy entertainment districts such as Black Bottom, and nurturing an urban booze production industry that gave the city the nickname the City on a Still. All this happened under the eye of the Purple Gang, a mostly Jewish organized crime outfit known for its excessive violence. If it wasn't the wettest city, Detroit was a heavyweight to be sure. However, I doubt any U.S. city had a bigger impact on Prohibition culture than New York. This was mostly because the Big Apple was home to a gigantic publishing industry, one that loved to write about Prohibition and make fun of those enforcing it, and many of the magazines and newspapers printed there had national syndication. It was one thing to have speakeasy owners, bootleggers, and smugglers attending New York criminal courts to identify Prohibition agents and learn new tricks. However, if that tactic made it into a nationally distributed publication, Prohibition dodgers everywhere would know to make trips to their local courthouses. Similarly, New York newspapers advertised kits that allowed people to make their own alcohol, and they were available to be delivered across the country. The NYC publishing industry helped make breaking the Volstead Act easier for the U.S. as a whole, and that's in addition to all the law-breaking that went on there. New York was wet to the extreme. The other cities mentioned all had their own reasons for qualifying as especially wet, but in talking about Kansas City, the example of Pittsburgh is illuminating. Pennsylvania City was probably on the list due to its position as a midpoint between the East Coast cities and the Midwest. For one thing, this location made it a smuggling capital. For another, jazz bands traveling between the two regions would often stop and play gigs there, resulting in Pittsburgh's Hill District becoming a nightlife hotspot. Kansas City would develop an even bigger nightlife scene, becoming one of the major cultural capitals of the interwar United States, up there alongside New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New Orleans. And, similarly to Pittsburgh, one reason Kansas City found itself in this situation would be its role as a hub in the rail transportation network of the USA. However, that was one of several factors in its growth as a Sin City. There were many things that fueled interwar Kansas City's scene, and some of them were decidedly unsavory. The Kansas City of the interwar era was, of course, partially Prohibition meeting the town's Wild West history. This wouldn't be the first time the place would be a vice capital after all. However, probably the most important factor in the creation of this world-class Sin City had more or less nothing to do with the city's criminal streak, the U.S. train system, or the Volstead Act. Kansas City was the site of an extremely powerful example of a government structure known as a political machine. Things were absurdly wild in Kansas City, with gambling, drinking, prostitution, and cutting-edge music flowing through the veins of the place. However, the fact is that the situation was far from out of control. In fact, the opposite was true. Essentially, Kansas City's nightclub era was only able to exist because of the rule of a politician named Tom Pendergast, so much so that it was nicknamed Tom's Town. Without Pendergast's corrupt government clearing the way for Kansas City's vice-friendly atmosphere, there would be nothing to talk about here. This part of the story began when Tom's older brother, Jim Pendergast, built a political machine in Kansas City. These were common in the early United States. Essentially, political machines utilized the lack of a welfare state to keep political power. If you were poor in Kansas City, you didn't have much in the way of a safety net, but you did have a vote, which actually mattered a lot in local elections. Machines would buy votes and give favors in return. Due to a lack of other options, this was how many immigrant communities survived nationwide, most notably Irish Americans. Political bosses would give voters government jobs, such as hiring them as police officers, which is why the police would do what the machine wanted. And it was like that at many levels of government in Kansas City. There were certainly politicians opposed to the machine in the interwar years, but they didn't have the power to unseat it. When Jim Pendergast left politics in 1911, he passed control of the machine to his younger brother Tom. Things were running so smoothly that the Kansas City machine was nicknamed Little Tammany, after the most famous machine of all, the Tammany Hall political system in New York City. However, during the Tom's Town era, Tom Pendergast probably exerted more control over his city than any individual leader in New York did. It was essentially a dictatorship with Tom as the dictator. City Hall was known as the House of Pendergast, and Missouri's state capitol was nicknamed Uncle Tom's Cabin. Pendergast even handpicked Harry Truman as a U.S. Senator. Truman, of course, would go on to be the President of the United States. In what was likely his biggest move on the national stage, Pendergast was able to secure a presidential pardon from Theodore Roosevelt for a man who was obviously guilty of some serious white-collar crime. In addition to the Pendergast machine, which itself largely depended on Irish American voters, there were several smaller machines that fit into the equation. One was an African American machine based in 18th and Vine, run by a man named Felix Payne, and another was an Italian American organization based in Kansas City's Little Italy. When Prohibition came into effect in 1920, the machine had a built-in distribution system for alcohol, given its infrastructure of neighborhood politicians that all answered to Pendergast. In fact, Tom ran a wholesale liquor business before the Volstead Act passed, even suing the federal government over Prohibition. Because of this, he was well equipped to store the booze and distribute outside of the region as well. Before 1920, Pendergast had also run a hotel named the Jefferson, which notoriously had a cozy relationship with law enforcement. Police allowed it to stay open past the curfew for serving booze, while that curfew was enforced at other establishments. Supposedly, Pendergast went clean shortly after the Volstead Act came into effect, but at the very least he certainly took bribes and controlled who was running and serving liquor in Kansas City. Because he was almost instantly filthy rich off bootlegging and other vice industries, Pendergast had the money to solidify his power. The machine was how the city functioned. Cops looked the other way because they were the machine. In fact, patrol officers were known to act as guides, taking customers to gambling and drinking establishments if asked. Vice flourished because Tom Pendergast led it. Oddly enough, part of why he did that was to finance a horrific gambling addiction. Gamblers need money, and, well, Tom was good at getting it. He needed to be. One estimate puts his betting at, in today's money, $15 million a year. In addition to political favors, the Pendergast machine relied heavily on violence. For example, election days saw street brawls in many parts of the city, and Pendergast had his own notorious team of enforcers. However, partway through Prohibition, the machine would get even more of an edge. In 1926, Pendergast would strike a deal with a man named John Lazia, the Brooklyn-born head of a local Sicilian Mafia faction, and the mob and the machine would more or less fuse. Kansas City's Italian population formed after the horrible 1891 lynching of several innocent Italian Americans in New Orleans, after which much of that city's Italian American population left for the Midwest. Most of the Kansas City Italian American community was similarly innocent and not a part of any criminal organization, but sadly, the proto-mob organization known as the Black Hand followed the population upriver, and the extortion that group was known for became a major problem in Kansas City's Little Italy. After Prohibition began, the same economic boom that boosted the Pendergast machine also helped the Kansas City Mafia take shape. Besides being a center for alcohol smuggling and, to a lesser degree, production, Kansas City was also a headquarters for narcotics trafficking in the United States in the Pendergast era, due to cooperation between the machine and organized crime. The city's mafia was one of the most powerful in the U.S. At a national mob meeting in 1929, Kansas City was one of only 5 cities represented. New York City, Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit were the others. The Kansas City mob has remained relevant and has popped up in fictional works like The Godfather, The Sopranos, and the TV series Ozark, but its heyday was during Prohibition. This was when it, coupled with the Pendergast machine, became the definitive power in Middle America. The police department specifically answered to Lazia, who staffed it with an unfortunate amount of criminals. Because of this power, Lazia was able to make or break people that came to Kansas City. If criminals didn't register with his people before taking up residence in the city, they would likely get arrested, and who knows what else would happen. In addition, Lazia would provide a place to lay low in the city for a fee. Yes, a payment to Kansas City law enforcement could get you set up to hide out safe from other law enforcement. Pretty ridiculous. But it was hardly just the criminal element that ended up in the Pendergast-Lazia orbit. Jazz musicians were heavily tied into the machine. For one thing, Benny Moten, one of Kansas City's most legendary band leaders, was a good friend of Tom Pendergast and ran a powerful musicians' union. If you wanted to work gigs in Kansas City, you needed to get permission from Moten, which could, of course, be revoked if you slighted the machine. On a more granular level, jazz musicians were often bailed out by gangsters and protected by them at clubs. However, this intersection of worlds wasn't perfect, and musicians that played high-profile mob clubs commonly carried guns for their own protection. At John Lazia's own Cuban Gardens Club, conceived by the gangster after a 1927 visit to Havana, the pay for musicians was high, but the bouncers and in-club guards carried barely concealed pistols. The Cuban Gardens Club was located at the Pendergast-backed Riverside racetrack, which brought everything together. Jazz, the machine, and the mob were heavily entwined. But this situation wasn't meant to last, and the arguably good times couldn't roll on forever. There were 5 events that separately chipped away at the Pendergast machine's stranglehold on Kansas City. 1 was another constitutional amendment, 2 were murders, 1 was a market crash, and 1 was a conviction. The first of the 5 was the 1929 collapse of the New York Stock Exchange. As is normal in the history of the market, boom times happen based on dreams, and crashes are those dreams being shattered. For example, the 2008 crash happened after everyone realized that subprime mortgage loans weren't actually going to be paid off. As of 2023, the next crash will be the reckoning for unpayable student loans. In 1929, the trigger was land speculation in Florida. People were buying and selling properties in cities that just didn't exist. When it became clear that Floridian development was a sham, things took a quick dive, and the Great Depression began. Kansas City actually rode out that depression pretty well, but the amount of tourists and businessmen passing through the train station took a hit. Both travel hubs and Sin Cities rely on disposable income, and during the Great Depression, that was harder to come by. This sudden lack of business for organized crime meant other revenue streams had to be found, and rackets like extortion and kidnapping became more common. The second event happened in the middle of 1933. This was an infamous shootout known as the Union Station Massacre. In an attempt to free a convict named Frank Nash, a few men approached law enforcement as they were transferring Nash from a train to a private car headed to the federal prison in Leavenworth. Nash never made it to Leavenworth as he and 4 law enforcement officers were shot dead in broad daylight on a platform in one of the busiest train stations in the nation. Who exactly was involved in the shooting that day remains unclear, but the FBI was able to coerce a confession out of a local mobster, actually one of John Lazia's rivals, that fingered the famous Pretty Boy Floyd among other gangsters and thieves. In what was potentially a lie, Lazia himself was accused of hiding one of the killers after the crime. However, Lazia had indeed played a role in setting up the massacre, according to the book The Mafia and the Machine. Having orchestrated the removal of guns from the squad car the officers headed to the transfer, Lazia hoped that this would make the holdup go smoothly. The mass murder was all over the front pages of national newspapers, and Kansas City's response, a farce of an investigation, made it obvious the criminals were in control of law enforcement. This was, of course, an open secret within Kansas City, but now it was blatantly clear to the world. After this event, the political tide began to turn against the machine. The third event was the repeal of Prohibition, which occurred at the end of 1933. Eventually, the Anti-Saloon League and the rest of the dry lobby gave in to the fact that the 18th Amendment had been the opposite of effective, and politicians like Al Smith were successful in passing the 21st Amendment, which nullified Prohibition in the Volstead Act. Overall, this was clearly a good thing, as it cut the heart out of organized crime, but it once again had the effect of making the Kansas City establishment look to other sources of revenue to keep their money coming in. More extortion and more kidnappings followed, but the main shift in business came in the form of the lug, a high unofficial tax on gambling establishments, which caused some such businesses to close. The fourth event was the 1934 murder of John Lazia, probably by rival mobsters. Lazia had been indicted for tax fraud earlier that year, partially due to the uneven finances of his Cuban Gardens Club. That was obviously bad news for the machine, but Lazia may well have beaten that rap. He was not, however, able to weasel his way out of machine gun fire. The after effects of Lazia's murder were not what you would expect. Normally, when a dominant organized crime figure is taken out of the picture, rival factions begin fighting over pieces of the pie the gangster had controlled. However, in this case, that didn't happen. Instead, it became apparent that Lazia had been a figurehead, a front for more shadowy Sicilian mob figures. This somewhat surprising reveal pulled back the curtain on the bigger players in the Italian Mafia, and contributed to this mob behind the mob's eventual outing and prosecution in the 1950s. The fifth event, the final nail in the coffin for the Pendergast machine, was the 1939 conviction of Tom Pendergast himself. Tom's undoing would be his gambling receipts, as his bets severely outweighed his official income. He was convicted of tax fraud. This was the biggest of many successful lawsuits the government brought against machine members, and clearly putting Tom Pendergast behind bars spelled the end for the status quo in Kansas City. The nightclub era ended abruptly. Jazz musicians moved on to New York and other cities. Criminals actually got punished, and the sin industry either disbanded or moved on to other cities like Galveston, Texas, and Newport, Kentucky. By the time World War II began, Kansas City had seen a ridiculous amount of cleanup. Although the mob would later attempt to turn Missouri into a state-sized Las Vegas, that never got off the ground. The party had come to an end. Obviously, Kansas City still exists today, but it has gotten significantly more boring. I personally was there a decade ago, and while it still has a cool vibe and is a place I would recommend spending some time in if you're in the neighborhood, it's a far cry from the town we've been talking about. Kansas City was once one of the United States' most important and vibrant metropolises, and now it is distinctly neither. But the end of the Pendergast era only cut into its vibrancy. Why isn't it still a major U.S. city? One word will sum it up: airplanes. As far as commercial flight, while it was technically available in the interwar era, it was for the rich and was extremely uncomfortable. This was well before the days of cabin pressure, so it was cold and very rocky. Throwing up was common. As far as cargo, the planes couldn't hold very much weight. The only shift of consequence that happened within the transportation industry during the interwar years was that the federal government of the United States gave its post office contracts to airlines, taking them away from rail. Additionally, the U.S. donated significant sums to the air industry in the form of subsidies. However, during World War II, plane technology advanced very quickly, and shortly after the war's end, things started to really change in the skies. These days, of course, passenger air travel dwarfs rail in most parts of the world, the USA included. It can be argued that interwar Kansas City was an intersection of multiple trends, and something that is unlikely to be repeated. First, sin in the United States is now commodified in forms such as Las Vegas and the college experience. That part of Kansas City wouldn't be entirely unique now. Booze is, obviously, legal. Transit hubs are more or less a thing of the past, with in-airport layovers the norm. And the welfare state took the place of the political machine long ago, for better or worse. The Paris of the Plains was unique at the time, and is probably unique in history. That's not to say that no one is keeping the flames alive. I mentioned the website pendergastkc.org, run by the Kansas City Library, which is an amazing resource if you're interested in the era. The American Jazz Museum, located within the 18th and Vine area, would be a great place to stop if you're in Kansas City. There are also local history tours if you visit, although I didn't personally take any and can't make recommendations. And, of course, the Pendergast era has been explored in a number of nonfiction books. The ones I most used writing this installment are Kansas City Jazz and the Mafia and the Machine, but there are a grip of other titles as well. For less regional information, I reference Dry Manhattan and Dangerous Rhythms. More information on all of those resources is available below. Hit the like button if you learned something, comment if we got anything wrong, and consider donating to our Patreon. You get a free weekly newsletter if you do. And subscribe to get a heads up as we explore more locations on the other map. Peace out.